Welcome back, everyone. We're diving into some fascinating stuff today, all about consciousness.
Yeah, some really interesting stuff.
You gave us quite the reading list. Excerpts from David Christopher Lane's Is My iPhone Conscious?
Oh, yeah.
We've also got some insights from Dr. Stephen Gislason and even a Tolstoy quote.
You really can't go wrong with
Don't
Tolstoy.
say no, right?
It's a pretty eclectic mix,
Sure.
but it all ties together in a really interesting way.
I am intrigued. So where do we even begin with all of this?
Well, let's start by setting the stage. We're not just trying to define consciousness here. We're going to grapple with some really big questions.
Okay, I'm ready to grapple.
Can science really explain those mystical experiences people have?
Right.
What are the limits of human perception?
Mm-hmm.
And how do we know if our experiences, even those that feel super real, are actually real?
That's a good question.
For sure. And Lane kicks things off with this really wild thought experiment.
Oh, yeah, I remember this part.
He asks us to imagine that our dreams are the only reality we know.
Like we're living in the Matrix.
Kind of. And then someone comes along and tells us that there's this whole other waking world out there that we're completely oblivious to.
I like how he uses Ramana as the example.
Yeah, Ramana is like this dream person trying to convince a skeptic like Patricia Churchland that this other waking world is real.
Right.
Of course, Churchland, being a neuroscientist, wants proof,
As she should.
but Ramana keeps insisting that the only way to experience this other reality is to basically die to the dream state.
Whoa. Talk about a leap of faith.
Right, but that's Lane's whole point. Our current understanding of consciousness might be totally limited by our current state of awareness.
I see what you mean. It's like we're stuck in Plato's cave only seeing shadows of the real world.
Exactly. Or the idea of flatland. You know,
Okay.
those two-dimensional beings who can't even fathom a third dimension.
We could be missing an entire dimension of reality and not even know it.
It's a mind-blowing concept.
It is. So how does Lane try to bridge the gap between those subjective experiences and the scientific method?
Well, he's really honest about his own struggles with this. Like, he talks about his debates with Patricia Churchland
Mm-hmm.
and how he found himself arguing from his personal mystical experiences,
Mm-hmm.
saying that no matter how advanced neuroscience gets, there's this feeling of being in a higher state of consciousness that just can't be explained by neurons firing.
That's interesting, but it also makes me wonder how reliable personal experiences can be as evidence.
Yeah, that's the tricky part. Lane admits that those kinds of arguments don't really fly in the scientific world
Right.
because you can't really measure or quantify a mystical experience. You can't put it under a microscope.
So how do we avoid falling into that trap of thinking that our personal truth is a universal truth?
That's the challenge, isn't it?
Yeah.
Lane uses the example of how some mystics tend to view their own path as superior,
Mm-hmm.
similar to how fundamentalists in any religion might think their way is the only right way.
I see your point. It's easy to get caught up in our own beliefs.
It really is.
Yeah.
And that can blind us to other possibilities.
Yeah.
So a healthy dose of skepticism is always a good thing, even when it comes to our own deeply held convictions.
That makes me think of the story Lane tells about Faqir Chand, the spiritual teacher, who had these incredibly vivid visions during a battle.
Oh, yeah. Fascinating story.
He initially believed those visions were divine intervention, and his colleagues even claimed they helped them survive.
I can see why they'd think that.
But then he comes to this radical realization that those visions were actually projections of his own mind.
So the experience felt totally real in the moment, but it wasn't actually happening outside of his own head.
Exactly. And he comes to this really thought-provoking conclusion.
Fill me in.
He says the more certain an experience feels, the more we should doubt its objective reality.
Wow, that's pretty deep.
It is. It's like saying that the things that feel the most real might actually be the most illusory.
Which kind of makes sense when you think about how easily our brains can trick us.
Oh, absolutely. Like V.S. Ramachandran's work with phantom limbs.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Yeah. He shows how people can feel pain in a limb that's no longer there.
Right.
Their brains are literally creating the sensation of a limb that doesn't exist.
So if our brains can do that, imagine the kinds of spiritual experiences they could cook up.
Exactly. It makes you question everything.
It does. But then there's that whole argument that science and mysticism are just two separate realms.
Yeah.
Like Michael Shermer's idea that A is A.
Right. Keep those domains separate.
Yeah. But if that's the case, then where does consciousness fit in?
Good question. If it's truly brain-based, shouldn't neuroscience eventually be able to explain it?
And if it can't, what does that tell us?
Right.
Hmm.
It's like this thought that maybe studying consciousness from a purely materialist perspective is like trying to understand music by only looking at the sheet music.
Interesting analogy. I like that.
And then Lane has this really funny anecdote about the sound grenade iPhone app.
Oh, yeah. I remember that.
He and one of his students couldn't hear this high-pitched sound that was supposed to make people feel sick.
And everyone else could hear it.
Everyone else could hear it perfectly fine.
That's wild.
Right. But Lane uses it as this analogy for the challenges of studying consciousness. It's like, if we can't even perceive certain phenomena, how can we possibly study them?
Especially when it comes to something as subjective as consciousness.
So where do we go from here?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't
Well,
it?
if personal experiences are unreliable and science can't fully grasp it, how do we move forward in understanding consciousness?
That's where things get really interesting, because some scientists, like Gerald Edelman, believe that as we get better at understanding the brain, we'll be able to actually create artificial consciousness.
Wait, so we might be able to build conscious machines?
That's the idea.
Yeah.
And Edelman won a Nobel Prize for his work on the immune system, so he's not just some random guy.
That is pretty mind-blowing.
It is. But then there's this other question that comes up.
Which is?
What if the scientists studying consciousness are missing a fundamental part of the equation?
What do you mean?
Their own awareness? Like, what if the very thing they're trying to study is also the thing that's allowing them to study it?
Oh, I see what you're saying.
And kind of a paradox.
It is. And Edelman actually tells this fascinating story about a patient with anosognosia, which is a condition that can happen after a stroke.
Okay.
And this patient was completely unaware of half of his body.
Really?
Like, he would only shave one side of his face or eat food off of half of his plate.
Wow.
And it wasn't because he couldn't physically do those things. It was because his brain wasn't processing that half of his body existed.
That's incredible.
Right. And Edelman uses this as an example of how the brain can literally construct its own reality, even if that reality is clearly inaccurate.
It makes you wonder what other ways our brains might be distorting our perceptions of reality.
Absolutely. And then you've got futurists like Ray Kurzweil predicting that by 2045, artificial intelligence will be indistinguishable from human consciousness.
Yeah, that's a whole other can of worms.
Talk about mind-blowing.
Right, like what happens when machines become self-aware? What rights would they have?
It's a lot to think about. But before we spiral down that rabbit hole, let's bring it back to how consciousness actually works in the brain.
Okay, sounds good.
We were talking about Dr. Stephen Gisleson's neurophysiological view of consciousness.
Right. He focuses on the thalamus.
Which is?
It's this structure in the brain that acts as a central relay station for sensory information.
Okay.
And Gisleson sees it as a kind of fountain that distributes and integrates information from all over the brain.
Interesting. So instead of consciousness being localized in one specific spot, it's more about the flow of information throughout the brain.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He uses this metaphor of the thalamus acting like a multi-channel mixer, blending together all these different inputs from our senses, emotions, memories, and thoughts to create that feeling of a unified self.
It's like the conductor of an orchestra bringing all the different instruments together to create a symphony.
I like that analogy.
And then there's the question of how interrupting that flow affects consciousness.
Right? Like what happens when you go under anesthesia?
Exactly. Everything just shuts down.
Which suggests that consciousness is this really dynamic and interconnected process.
Makes sense. But what I find really fascinating is how Gisleson connects it all to Eastern spiritual teachings.
Oh, yeah. Tell me more about that.
He draws these parallels between the neurological description of the thalamus integrating information and the subjective experience of non-dual awareness described in certain meditative states.
So he's saying there might be a neurological basis for those profound spiritual experiences people have during meditation.
Exactly. Which is pretty mind-blowing when you think about it.
It is. It makes you wonder if we're finally starting to understand how these ancient practices actually work.
Right. And it reminds me of the Tolstoy quote you mentioned earlier.
Oh, yeah, from Anna Karenina.
The one about Kitty's disillusionment with Madame Stahl.
Ah, yeah.
Kitty starts out idolizing this woman, but then she realizes that her idol is just a flawed human being.
And how does that relate to consciousness?
Well, just like Kitty's idealized image of Madame Stahl crumbles upon closer inspection, maybe our preconceived notions about consciousness will also change as we learn more.
That's a great point.
We've covered a lot of ground here, from the inner workings of the brain to the vastness of mystical experiences and even the possibility of artificial consciousness.
I know. It's a lot to unpack.
Where do we even begin?
It's funny how Lane uses that Tolstoy quote, you know?
Yeah.
It's a perfect metaphor for how science works.
Oh, so?
We often start with these grand ideas, these seemingly unshakable truths, and then we dig deeper, We question things.
Right.
And sometimes what we thought we knew changes completely.
It's like that saying, the more you know, the more you realize you don't know.
Exactly.
Right.
And that's what makes exploration so exciting.
Speaking of exciting, we were talking about the idea of AI becoming indistinguishable from human consciousness.
Oh, yeah.
Didn't Lane actually write a whole book about that?
He did.
What was it called?
The Singularity and the End of the Human Era.
Catchy title.
Right. And it's all about the implications of machines becoming super intelligent.
So, like, what happens when AI surpasses human intelligence?
Exactly. He even speculates about things like whether AI could create some kind of technological divinity.
Okay, now that's getting a little out there.
I know it sounds like science fiction,
It does.
but is it really that far-fetched?
Yeah, I mean, AI is already doing some pretty amazing things.
Right, like writing poetry, composing music.
Even diagnosing diseases.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And the speed of development is just increasing exponentially.
So Kurzweil's prediction of 2045,
Yeah.
that might not be as crazy as it sounds.
Not at all. The real question is, what will it mean for us? For how we understand consciousness and what it means to be human.
Yeah, it's a lot to consider.
It is.
But before we go down that rabbit hole,
Okay.
let's come back to the challenges of actually studying consciousness.
All right, good idea.
You know, remember that debate between Lane and Churchland?
Oh, yeah.
He's talking about his mystical experiences, and she's all about empirical evidence.
Classic clash of perspectives.
It is. And it really highlights this tension between subjective experience and objective proof.
Right. How do you measure something as intangible as awareness?
Yeah. How do you design an experiment to test for a higher state of consciousness?
That's a tough one.
It's like trying to catch a dream in a butterfly net.
I like that.
And even Lane admits that relying on personal experiences or analogies doesn't really cut it in the scientific world.
It's just not considered rigorous enough.
Right. And he talks about how some mystics can get a little too attached to their own path.
Oh, yeah.
Like they view their way as superior.
It's that whole my religion is better than your religion kind of thing.
Exactly.
Which can be a real obstacle to understanding.
So are we stuck in this endless loop of subjective claims and skeptical rebuttals?
Well, Lane seems to think that the key might be finding a way to objectively study those altered states of consciousness that mystics have been talking about for centuries.
So like finding the scientific basis for those experiences.
Exactly.
Yeah.
He compares it to how people used to think that the god Neptune controlled the oceans.
Okay.
And then we discovered H2O.
Right.
And suddenly it became a matter of chemistry, not mythology.
So we need to find the H2O of consciousness.
That's the idea.
But how do we even begin to do that?
Well, it would probably involve finding ways to reliably induce and measure those higher states of awareness.
So we can understand the underlying mechanisms.
Right. It's definitely a long shot.
Yeah.
But that's the beauty of science.
What do you mean?
It's all about pushing the boundaries of what we think is possible.
I like that.
You know, sometimes you have to go against conventional thinking.
Like Darwin did with his theory of evolution.
Exactly. He went against the grain, and it revolutionized our understanding of life itself.
Maybe exploring the mysteries of consciousness will lead to equally profound discoveries.
It's possible.
Okay.
It could change our understanding of everything.
Now I'm getting excited.
Me too.
But let's bring it back down to earth for a minute. We were talking about Gislaswan's fountain analogy for the thalamus.
Uh-huh.
Are there any other neurological models that try to explain how consciousness emerges?
Oh, yeah. There are tons of theories out there.
Really?
Yeah. Some focus on specific brain regions like the prefrontal cortex, planning, decision-making, that kind of stuff.
Okay.
Others look at the interplay of neural networks, how different parts of the brain work together.
It's like trying to solve a giant jigsaw puzzle.
Exactly. Each piece contributes to the overall picture. But how do those pieces fit together to create the feeling of being you?
Yeah, that's the big question.
And there are all sorts of approaches to trying to answer it.
Like trying to create artificial consciousness.
Exactly, like Gerald Edelman and his conscious machines.
Right. Which brings us back to that whole idea of AI potentially becoming indistinguishable from human consciousness.
It's mind-blowing to think that we might actually be on the verge of creating a new form of intelligent life.
I know. It's both exhilarating and terrifying at the same time.
It really is.
And it raises all sorts of ethical questions.
For sure. Like, what rights would a conscious machine have?
Would we consider it a person?
Would it have a soul?
Those are some really big questions.
They are.
Maybe we're getting ahead of ourselves.
Probably.
Let's stick with what we know for now.
Sounds good.
We were discussing the thalamus and its role in consciousness.
Right.
Didn't Xyloson compare it to A multi-channel mixer?
He did.
Yeah.
It's a helpful analogy.
It is. It helps to visualize how all these different inputs come together.
Exactly.
So the thalamus is like the central hub,
Uh-huh.
taking in information from our senses, emotions, memories, thoughts,
And then blending it all together into this coherent stream of experience.
like the conductor of an orchestra,
Exactly.
bringing all the different instruments together to create this symphony of consciousness.
I like that.
But with all these analogies, aren't we oversimplifying things a bit?
You're right.
I mean, Lane keeps reminding us how easily our brains can deceive us.
Oh, yeah, like with phantom limbs.
Exactly.
Analogies are useful, but they can only take us so far.
So where do we go from here?
Well, I think we need to keep pushing the boundaries of scientific inquiry. You know,
Huh?
developing new technologies, new methods.
To better understand consciousness.
Exactly.
And maybe those new discoveries will challenge our fundamental assumptions about reality itself.
Perhaps. What if our current understanding is just the tip of the iceberg?
That's an interesting thought.
Imagine the possibilities if we could reliably access and study those deeper layers of consciousness.
What new insights might emerge? What new possibilities might open up? It's a question that keeps coming back to me. It's like we're starting to see glimpses of something much grander.
And that's pretty exciting.
It does feel like we're onto something big, you know?
Yeah.
Like those early explorers setting sail for uncharted territory.
I like that analogy.
But this time the exploration is inward.
Exploring the inner space of consciousness.
Exactly. And Lane actually talks about this idea of transpersonal science.
Oh, yeah.
Like maybe mysticism offers ways of knowing that go beyond our current scientific methods.
That's a really interesting idea.
It is. He seems to be suggesting that there might be ways of experiencing reality that are just completely inaccessible to the tools of science as we understand them today.
Right. Which raises some pretty big questions.
Like what?
Like, what if there are aspects of reality that we just can't measure or quantify? Does that mean those aspects are any less real?
It's a good question. It really challenges our assumptions about what constitutes knowledge.
It does.
Yeah.
And it brings us back to that idea we talked about earlier.
The one about doubting our most certain experiences.
Exactly, the Chandian effect.
Right.
It's a good reminder that our brains are incredibly powerful and can create all sorts of convincing illusions.
Especially when it comes to those mystical or spiritual experiences.
Exactly.
But isn't there a danger that being too skeptical could kind of take the magic out of those experiences?
That's a valid concern.
You know, if we're always second-guessing ourselves, won't we miss out on the wonder and the awe?
I don't think so. I think true wonder comes from a place of curiosity
Okay.
and a willingness to embrace the unknown.
So it's not about finding definitive answers.
Not necessarily. It's more about acknowledging the mystery, the vastness of what we don't understand.
And being open to the possibility that there's more out there.
Exactly.
I like that. It's like a child looking up at the stars for the first time.
Filled with wonder.
Yeah, but also understanding that there's so much more to learn.
And that's where the real adventure begins.
It's not about having all the answers.
It's about the journey.
The journey of exploration.
Expanding our consciousness.
Deepening our understanding of ourselves and the world around us.
Exactly.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into consciousness, what's the one thing you want our listeners to walk away with?
That's a good question. I think the biggest takeaway for me is this idea that if consciousness really is multidimensional,
As Lane suggests.
right, then imagine how much our understanding of reality could change if we could reliably access and study those other states.
It's like opening a door to a whole new world,
A world that's always been there.
just hidden in plain sight.
And it's up to each of us to decide if we're willing to step through that door and explore what lies beyond.
This has been an amazing conversation.
It really has.
From the intricate workings of the brain to the vast mysteries of consciousness.
We've explored a lot of different ideas,
Challenged our assumptions.
hopefully sparked some curiosity along the way.
And most importantly, we hope we've inspired you to keep exploring the mysteries of consciousness.
Keep questioning.
Keep learning.
Keep diving deep.
You never know what you might discover.
That's right.
That's it for this episode of The Deep Dive.
Thanks for listening, everyone.
Until next time, keep those minds curious and those questions coming.